The ATV came back just after sunrise, loud enough to wake the birds, but not loud enough to wake my neighbors, and that part mattered more than you might think. Dust rolled up behind it like a warning sign, drifting over the wheat heads that were just starting to bow, heavy with grain, the same way they had every year since my father was a boy. The engine cut across the field without hesitation, no pause, no doubt, like the land had already been sold and nobody had bothered to tell me yet. She rode it like she owned the place. What she didn't see, what people like her never notice, is that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it just means someone is watching, taking notes, waiting for you to make the mistake you're absolutely convinced you'll never make. My name's not important, at least not yet, but for the sake of the story, you can call me Caleb Turner. I'm 56 years old, retired, or at least that's what I tell people when they ask what I do for a living. I live on 42 acres of farmland my family's owned since the early 1920s, tucked right in the middle of a shiny new development called Hawthorne Ridge, the kind of place with matching mailboxes, identical lawns, and neighbors who wave just enough to look friendly without committing to an actual conversation. After 30 years working federal land enforcement, I wanted quiet. Real quiet. Wheat, fences, a couple head of cattle, and mornings where the loudest sound was the wind moving through grain. I thought I'd earned that. Then Lydia Cross decided my farm was a problem. Lydia was 43, a real estate attorney by trade, HOA president by ambition, and the kind of woman who spoke in complete sentences even when she was furious. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. She had binders, tablets, letterhead, and a smile that said she was doing you a favor whether you wanted it or not. She saw my land the way a shark sees blood, not as a home, not as history, but as a badly parked obstacle between her neighborhood and a very profitable future. Our first real interaction happened on a Monday in September, cool enough to feel like fall, but warm enough to remind you summer wasn't done fighting yet. I was out checking the wheat, about 3 weeks from harvest, when I heard the whine of that ATV cutting through the field like a chainsaw through memory. She pulled up 10 feet from me, killed the engine, and hopped off with a tablet tucked under her arm. Didn't ask permission. Didn't apologize for the tracks. Just smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Turner," she said, tapping her stylus against the screen, already scrolling. "I'm conducting a routine community security patrol, and I've noticed several compliance issues on your property." I remember thinking, this is either a joke or a test, and I wasn't sure which answer she was hoping for. I told her calmly, real calmly, the way you talk to someone who doesn't yet realize how wrong they are. "This is private land. It's not part of your HOA. You don't have permission to be here." She looked at me like I'd just told her gravity was optional. "Actually," she said, drawing the word out, "this access route is classified as a legacy utility path, which makes it subject to community oversight. Any property that impacts neighborhood standards and property values falls under HOA authority." She said it like she'd practiced in the mirror. I asked to see the documentation. She ignored me, stepped past, and started taking photos. My fence, my shed, my cattle, even the old wooden sign my grandfather put up that just said Turner Farm in faded paint. "Fence height violation," she said. "Agricultural signage visible from residential roads. Livestock odor complaints. Potential noise disturbances." Each sentence ended with a tap on the tablet, like a judge's gavel. "You'll receive formal notice within 48 hours, she added, climbing back onto the ATV. "There's a compliance timeline, but cooperation usually makes these things smoother for everyone." Then she took off again, straight through the wheat, leaving ruts so deep you could have twisted an ankle just looking at them. That afternoon, I drove into town and sat in the county records office for 3 hours, pulling deeds, surveys, easements, anything with my land's name on it. I already knew the answer, but I needed it in black and white. There was no public access road, no easement, no HOA authority. The trail, she mentioned, was a cattle path my grandfather wore down moving livestock between pastures, entirely inside our boundary lines. Case closed, or at least it should have been. But buried in the development records for Hawthorne Ridge was a detail that stuck with me. The original environmental impact report listed my farm as a permanent agricultural buffer, a required separation between the subdivision and the state highway. My land wasn't a mistake. It was part of the plan. By Thursday, the letters started coming. The first notice cited my fence for exceeding residential height standards, standards written for quarter-acre lots with decorative pickets, not working farms with livestock. The second complained that my private property signs were aggressive and unwelcoming, suggesting I replace them with messaging that encouraged community harmony. The third was my personal favorite, claiming my cattle posed potential air quality concerns and might violate environmental guidelines. Each letter was printed on professional letterhead, heavy paper, official language, soft threats tucked neatly between paragraphs. Legal enough to scare someone who didn't know better. Most people would have panicked. Some would have complied just to make it stop. But I'd spent decades dealing with real authority, real enforcement, real consequences. I knew the difference between law and theater. And Lydia Cross was running a very polished show. What bothered me wasn't the audacity, it was the precision. This wasn't random. This was systematic, calculated, and expensive. She wasn't trying to fix a problem. She was trying to create one so big it would eventually swallow me whole. The second week, she escalated. She hosted what she called a community standards forum, sent glossy invitations to every homeowner, including me, and framed it as a friendly discussion about maintaining property values. I didn't go, but Martha Lowell, a retired school administrator with a spine of steel, did, and she told me everything. Lydia had photos of my land on a projector, taken from angles that made it look neglected, invasive, out of place. She talked about non-conforming properties, about investments, about how one person's choices could affect hundreds of families. She never said my name like an accusation. She didn't have to. By the end of the night, I wasn't a neighbor anymore. I was the situation. That's when I realized this wasn't just about rules or fences or cattle. It was about control, about reshaping reality until enough people believed the same lie that it might as well be true. And standing there in my kitchen that night, staring out at a wheat field that had fed my family for generations, I understood something else too. This woman had no idea who she'd decided to push. All right, let me pause the story for a second, because this is where a lot of people watching might be thinking, wait, can an HOA actually do that? And the short answer is no, but the long answer is where people get trapped. According to standard procedure, a homeowners association only has authority over properties that are explicitly included in its governing documents, things like the declaration, plats, and recorded covenants. If your land is not legally annexed into the HOA, their rules are just words on paper. Scary-looking words, sure, but still meaningless without jurisdiction. From a legal perspective, what Lydia was doing is something I've seen over and over again. You don't need real authority if you can create the illusion of authority. Official letterhead, deadlines, references to compliance, vague mentions of environmental impact, those are pressure tools. They're designed to trigger fear, not to hold up in court. And this is where psychology comes in, because this is a psychological trap. When someone hits you with rapid-fire accusations and paperwork, your brain goes into survival mode. You stop asking, is this real? And start asking, how do I make this stop? That's the pivot point abusers rely on. Another key tactic here is social framing. Lydia wasn't just targeting me. She was shaping the narrative around me. Once you're labeled as the problem, every action you take gets filtered through that lens. Silence looks like guilt. Resistance looks like selfishness. Compliance looks like admission. This is why so many people lose fights they were legally entitled to win. Not because the law wasn't on their side, but because the pressure campaign worked faster than their understanding of their rights. The lesson here is simple but uncomfortable. Most HOA abuse doesn't start with fines or lawsuits. It starts with confidence, repetition, and the assumption that you won't push back hard enough to expose the bluff. All right, back to the story, because this is where Lydia pushed it too far. When I say Lydia pushed it too far, I don't mean legally. Legally, she'd already crossed that line a dozen times. I mean, she crossed the line where intimidation turns into obsession, where control turns into entitlement, where someone stops pretending they're the good guy and starts believing they're untouchable. Week 3 started with a phone call from the county agricultural office. The inspector was polite, almost apologetic, the way people get when they already know they're wasting your time. Someone had filed a complaint alleging I was running an unpermitted commercial livestock operation that posed environmental and health risks to nearby homes. Specific language. Very specific. The kind that automatically triggers an investigation. He spent the morning walking my land, checking records, asking questions he already knew the answers to. My farm had been registered since 1924. Zoning hadn't changed. Environmental compliance exceeded requirements. No violations. As we wrapped up, he shook his head and said quietly, "Whoever filed this knows exactly what words to use." That sentence stuck with me. The health department came next, then environmental services, then a soil and groundwater test that took 2 weeks to process because the complaint referenced nitrogen saturation thresholds and downstream impact. Each visit ended the same way. No violations, no issues, but each one left behind a paper trail. That was the point. Lydia wasn't trying to win quickly. She was building a case slowly, stacking documents, complaints, and reports until my life became an administrative nightmare. Even if I won, she wanted me exhausted, broke, and isolated by the time it was over. Then came the lawsuit. A process server knocked on my door at 6 in the morning, thick envelope in hand. Private nuisance. Financial harm. Interference with quiet enjoyment. $50,000 in damages, plus a request for a court order forcing me to bring my property into compliance with community standards. Community standards. Not law. Not zoning. Standards. She alleged my cattle created noise pollution, that my equipment violated residential noise ordinances, that my land attracted wildlife that threatened pets, that my farm was incompatible with the character of the neighborhood. It was impressive in a twisted way. Real statutes twisted just enough to sound plausible, expensive enough to fight that most people would fold. But the real dagger came a few days later when I received a copy of an environmental impact report Lydia had commissioned privately. 40-plus pages. Professional photos. Air samples. Soil analysis. Wildlife disruption models. The conclusion was blunt. My land, according to their experts, was incompatible with surrounding residential use and should be transitioned into something more appropriate. In plain English, she wanted me gone. I was still processing that when the final escalation happened. It was early October, fog thick enough to mute sound, the kind of morning where the world feels smaller. I walked out to check the wheat and felt my stomach drop before my brain caught up. The field was destroyed. Not randomly. Deliberately. An ATV had carved through the grain in looping, intentional lines that spelled out 2 words you could read from a quarter-mile away. Move out. 3 months of work. Seed. Fertilizer. Labor. Gone overnight. I was standing there, hands on my knees, trying to breathe, when I heard engines. Cameras. Voices. Lydia arrived with a local news crew and 2 reporters, already mid-performance. She stood in front of my ruined crop like it was a backdrop she'd ordered in advance. "This is exactly why we need stronger community standards," she said into the microphones, gesturing behind her. "When individuals refuse to cooperate, tensions escalate, and everyone suffers." She was using vandalism, my vandalism, as proof that I was the problem. And that's when something in me snapped into place. I'd been treating this like a dispute, like something that could be reasoned through. Lydia wasn't negotiating. She was executing a plan. That night, I opened my laptop and logged into systems I hadn't touched in 2 years. Old credentials. Still active. Consulting contracts have their perks. What I found in the first hour made my hands shake. Hawthorne Ridge had unresolved federal land title issues dating back to the late 1970s. Incomplete transfers. Overlapping claims. Administrative limbo. Hundreds of acres sitting in a gray zone that developers hate and lawyers love. And Lydia's name was all over it. Buried deeper was the real bombshell. A signed agreement, dated 6 weeks earlier, between Lydia and a development firm called Brightmark Holdings. 15 acres of expansion land sold for just over $2 million. The package included my farm. Land she didn't own. Land she couldn't sell. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was fraud. The pattern got uglier the more I dug. Similar tactics in other communities. Same role. Same pressure. Same outcome. Owners forced out. Land acquired cheap. Developments approved fast. My farm wasn't special. It was just next. The next morning, I got an unexpected knock at my door. Evan Cross, Lydia's husband, stood there looking like he hadn't slept in days, holding a cardboard box full of documents. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I think my wife is committing crimes," he said, "and I don't know how to stop her." What he had was devastating. Forged signatures. HOA accounts drained through fake violations. Illegal fines collected and never reported. Contracts signed in his name without consent. That afternoon, Another ally surfaced. Martha Lowell, the retired administrator, had been quietly documenting everything for over a year: letters, recordings, timelines. She'd been waiting for someone who knew how to connect the dots. The trap came together fast. Lydia scheduled a community meeting to announce a major development opportunity. Full presentation, renderings, promises of rising property values. The room was packed. Residents, reporters, observers. Lydia walked in confident, polished, untouchable. She talked about luxury amenities, partnerships, and prosperity. Then she put my farm on the screen and announced that legal proceedings were underway to acquire it for the public good. That's when Evan stood up. Then Martha. Then me. I laid out federal records, contracts, bank statements, and video evidence. Yes, including footage of Lydia on my property the night my wheat was destroyed. The room shifted from confusion to fury in real time. And when a federal agent stood up and identified herself, advising Lydia to contact an attorney immediately, the mask finally fell. She didn't get arrested that day, but her career ended right there, under fluorescent lights, in front of everyone she'd lied to. And for the first time since this started, the silence wasn't mine anymore. People always ask me how it felt watching Lydia's whole operation collapse, whether it felt like victory, revenge, justice, and the honest answer is, it felt quiet. Not relief exactly, not celebration. Just this deep, steady quiet, like something heavy had finally been set down after being carried way too far. Because here's the thing nobody tells you when you're in the middle of something like this. Most battles with power aren't loud. They're slow, administrative, exhausting. They happen in envelopes, emails, meetings you don't want to attend, and nights where you stare at the ceiling wondering if standing your ground is worth losing your peace. Lydia didn't win for as long as she did because she was smarter than everyone else. She won because she understood something fundamental about human behavior. We're conditioned to obey confidence, especially when it wears a suit and carries paperwork. Most people don't challenge authority because they assume someone else already checked the rules. The lesson here is that fake authority survives on isolation. The moment people start comparing notes, asking questions out loud, sharing documents, sharing stories, that's when the illusion cracks. Lydia's power wasn't legal, it was psychological. Once that spell broke, the whole structure collapsed under its own weight. From a legal perspective, what saved me wasn't just knowing the law, it was recognizing patterns. Harassment disguised as procedure, enforcement without jurisdiction, social pressure masquerading as community values. Those are red flags, and they show up in HOAs, workplaces, schools, even families. The setting changes, the playbook doesn't. But I also learned something uncomfortable about myself. I'd spent years believing that if you stayed quiet, stayed compliant, stayed reasonable, eventually the truth would sort itself out. That's not always how it works. Sometimes silence isn't maturity, it's permission. What changed everything wasn't one dramatic confrontation. It was people choosing not to look away. Evan risking his marriage to do the right thing. Martha trusting her instincts instead of dismissing them. Neighbors realizing that the fear they felt wasn't personal, it was manufactured. After the dust settled, Hawthorne Ridge changed. The HOA didn't disappear, it evolved. Transparent finances, clear limits, shared decision-making. Fewer rules, better ones. Turns out most people don't want control, they want fairness. My farm's still here. The wheat grew back stronger the next season, almost stubbornly so. The field Lydia tried to erase became a reminder, not just for me, but for the whole community, that standing your ground doesn't always look heroic in the moment, but it echoes longer than intimidation ever does. And I get letters now, emails, messages from people dealing with their own versions of this story. Corrupt boards, overreaching managers, officials who've confused authority with entitlement. I always tell them the same thing. Start documenting, start talking, and don't let official language scare you into forgetting your own common sense. Because power hates daylight. It hates questions. It hates people who refuse to be rushed into silence. So I'll leave you with this. If you've ever felt pressured by an HOA, a boss, a committee, anyone who keeps telling you this is just how it works, ask yourself one question. According to who? And then ask it out loud. If this story hit close to home, I'd really like to hear about it. Drop your experience in the comments. What worked? What didn't? What you wish you'd known sooner? These conversations matter more than you think. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to someone abusing power is stay right where you are.